Hey listeners, last year was our 15th year of the best in food storytelling. As we head into 2025, we're kicking off a contest in collaboration with the podcast series Feast and Harmony and Sixth Man, where you have the opportunity to win a 4-night cruise for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, a food, wine, and spirits festival at sea. When you donate to HRN, you'll be entered for the chance to win a porthole cabin for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, sailing May 5th through 9th, 2025, from Miami to Cozumel, Mexico on Norwegian Gem. You'll also support another year of great food storytelling with a portion of your donation going toward disaster relief for the food and beverage communities within Western North Carolina and Southern California. This cruise is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for culinary adventurers, featuring top celebrity chefs including Jonathan Waxman, Antonio Lafaso, Robert Irvine, and many, many more. There's a myriad of experiences such as restaurant takeovers, live food and mixology demos, themed parties, and more. To enter your chance to win, please visit heritageradionetwork.org/cruise. Terms and conditions apply. You must be 21 or over to enter. That's heritageradionetwork.org/cruise.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Wisconsin, the state of cheese, makes half of the nation's specialty cheese and wins more awards than any other state or country. Our heritage and traditions, master cheesemaker program, and the American propensity for innovation all put Wisconsin on the cutting wedge of cheesemaking. With over 600 varieties of cheese to choose from and 5,500 national and international awards and counting, get ready to turn your refrigerator into a trophy case. Enjoying a Wisconsin cheese is basically like winning a gold medal in culinary achievement. Set your mind at cheese. When you bite into a wedge of Wisconsin Wonderful, you know it is made with the ultimate skill and passion possible. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways. Hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. A lot of you all might have remember from last season when I talked to Lilia Bundles about Madam C.J. Walker and my great-grandfather, who was her personal doctor. On this episode, we're going to talk with Leon Bates, a scholar, an Indiana native, an Army veteran, and someone who has done extensive research on my great-grandfather, Dr. Joseph Henry Ward, who was enlisted in World War I in the 92nd Division, an all-Black regiment during World War I. He was also the hospital director at the Veterans Hospital number 91 at Tuskegee. He was a lieutenant colonel, the only surgeon under the African American Medical Corps that was commissioned to be the surgeon of that time. He was also Madam C.J. Walker's doctor, who lived and operated her business from our living room. Recently, he received an Exceptional Service Award from the Department of Veteran Affairs 100 years later, which I was so proud about because I lost my mother and she wasn't able to be there for the acceptance of that award. So it was a huge honor for our family. Now, I remember talking to Leon about the television show, The Nick, that he suggested that I watch. And if some of you all know that show, it talks a lot about the late 19th century, early 20th century medicine and what it was like in American healthcare systems back then. And it was quite alarming to watch. So I want to just introduce and welcome Leon Bates. We have so much to talk about. I was there about a year ago. I was in Indianapolis about a year ago. And for the first time, I was able to visit the grave markers of my great-grandparents. Dr. Joseph Henry Ward, and who I'm named after, Zella Locklear Ward, and their son, Buddy, who died during Spanish influenza. So it was a huge honor for me to stand where they stood and to give honor to them at their grave sites. So welcome, Leon. Welcome to Culture and Flavor.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I want to just kind of back up and just talk about how did you find Dr. Joseph Henry Ward?
I had gone back to school at IUPUI, Indiana University, Indianapolis now, and was looking for a research project for a class. And I knew about Black police officers in Indianapolis, and I turned that into my research project. It was an independent study with one of the professors there. And I wrote about the first Black police officer killed in Indianapolis in 1922. And this officer was taken to Ward's sanitarium, where he was a patient for about 6 months after he was shot in June, and he died in November. And one question I came away from that when it was done was, what was Ward's sanitarium? I'd never heard of it. Everyone I asked had never heard of it. And I went to the old city directories from 1922, and I found the address for it and the name Joseph Ward, and it didn't mean anything to me. It was just, okay. And several years later, I was researching something else and came across a file at the Indiana State Archives about Ward Sanitarium. And in that file, it talked about Dr. Ward, it talked about the sanitarium and the things he was doing. And a couple things jumped out at me. One is that Department of Charities and Hospital, I think it was called, went out to every hospital and did an inspection annually, and they listed everything. And I finally figured out Dr. Ward was a Black doctor, and he had his own sanitarium, which I basically would equate today to being a surgery center that he operated. And the report said at the time he had a laboratory, he had a maternity area, he had a recovery area for surgery, a surgery area, and he had an x-ray machine. And I just had to stop when I was reading that and think, wait a minute, 1922, an African-American doctor has his own x-ray machine. It's like, this guy is different. He's just so different. And then I kept reading through the file, and I found a note that he had served in the U.S. Army. I think, okay. There were a lot of African-Americans who served in World War I. In fact, I think there were somewhere around 400,000 of them. And one day I was just searching around on the internet. I don't know what I was doing at home, and I found that he was buried at Crown Hill Cemetery. So I decided I needed to take a bike ride one day, and I rode over to Crown Hill Cemetery and rode around it, and I found his grave. And when I found his grave and I walked up the hill to where it's located, he has a government issued grave marker. And most people would just see it and not pay any attention to it. When I looked at it, and it said LTC Joseph H. Ward, MD. And below that it said U.S. Army. It was just abbreviation U.S. Army -Medical Corps. And then I was really stumped. It was like, wait a minute. I did not know that there were Black doctors who served in World War I. I did not know there were Black doctors who had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army during the First World War. Now I'm really sure this guy is different, and that's sent me on a multi-year journey to figure out who Dr. Joseph Ward was. And I'm still learning about him. And I will say this: if I can manage to accomplish half of what that man did in his lifetime, I will have done something.
You know you're going to make me cry already.
Look, when you think about the fact that Joseph Henry Ward was born in the same slave cabin that his mother was born in, that his mother was born enslaved. He is a first-generation freedman. He manages to become a medical doctor, a surgeon, a U.S. Army officer, a U.S. Veterans Administration hospital administrator, an entrepreneur who owned and operated his own medical facility. And he does all this between Plessy versus Ferguson, which made Jim Crow legal, and Brown versus Board of Education, which made segregation illegal, or at least out of bounds. In that time period, this man does all those things, and he didn't have half of the opportunities and half of the not sure what word I want to use, but the possibilities that I have, that you and I take for granted. These things were not afforded to him, and yet he still managed to do all the things I just named. He was Madam C.J. Walker's personal physician, along with many other people, while he was running his own surgery center in Indianapolis. The State Archive record indicated that there were people who came from more than 100 miles just to have him do their surgery and go home. And as I learned more about the history of medicine in the United States, I appreciated who and what he was even more. When you think about today, many people have heard of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment at Tuskegee, Alabama. It went on from 1932 to 1972, I think it is. If you think about in the 1950s, Henrietta Lacks, who goes to a hospital in Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, and her tissues were harvested while they were treating her for cancer. But those same tissues are still being used today in medical research, and those tissues are called HeLa cells. And the name HeLa comes from the first two initials of her first name and her last name. So Henrietta Lacks, H-E-L-A. There's where you get HeLa cells from. And those HeLa cells are still used today. That's the same technology that was used to create the polio vaccine. In many vaccines and other cancer research, there's many things that today, those cells are still used, and they're what they call the immortal line. And what that means is that those cells will reproduce themselves in a laboratory. So they're still growing her cells in a laboratory today. And then those cells are sold to laboratories around the world. And they have generated millions of dollars for different people and companies. But Henrietta Lacks' family was consigned to poverty. They did not even know that had been done until the 1990s, when someone came knocking on the door to ask if they could collect some more cells. That's how that story came out.
I really want you to paint the picture of what our healthcare system was like during Dr. Ward's time. When I remember, I'm so grateful for you, for Lilia Bundles, who have done extensive research on him and just his role in that time period in Black American and African American history, but also in American history and the American medical history. But I want to just, when I look back, I think about my grandmother and her telling me about how her dad would go with him to operate in the farms, and it would sometimes be under candlelight. And, he went to Mayo, he studied at Mayo Clinic. I mean, he did all of these extraordinary things for the time that, weren't available to a lot of African. And the fact that he left Wilson, North Carolina as a teenager to move to Indianapolis. And I would love for you to talk about what it was like during that time and to be Dr. Joseph Ward and understanding who he came from and the drive and the momentum of African Americans and why a lot of them moved to Indianapolis at that time. And sometimes we talk a lot about Chicago, New York, et cetera, but we forget about how pivotal Indianapolis was in the making of America.
Yeah. Joseph Ward was born in Wilson, North Carolina, as I said earlier, in the same slave cabinet his mother was born in. His maternal grandfather was a local white doctor in Wilson. So as a small child, he's seeing, at least from a distance, what a medical doctor does. And people come to the house, and his grandfather, who did nothing to help him become a medical doctor or to try and improve his future was a medical doctor. So he first sees this, and you said, as a teenager, and I think a young teenager, he leaves Wilson and he ends up in the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area, which is not uncommon for young men at that time to 15, 16 years old leave home. He does that. He's working for several years, and a chance encounter with a doctor from Indianapolis who was the head of the Physio Medical College in Indiana and a ranking member of the Physio Medical Society in Indiana, met Joseph Ward, and he had Joseph Ward travel back to Indianapolis with him. And he puts Joseph Ward in high school, gets him through high school, and then gets him through medical school. And Joseph is listed as his chauffeur and laborer, whatever he needed around the house. That's what he did. So he's living with this white doctor in Indianapolis who helps him get into medical school. And then, interesting enough, when he graduates high school in 1894 from Indianapolis High School, which was a segregated school, they did have a few black students, but not many. He graduates and he is the class valedictorian for 1894, which is something that's very unusual. I don't think it ever happened before he did it. Then he goes on to medical school at the Physio Medical College, and he finishes that. And in 1897, in the spring of 1897, he gets his medical license and hangs out his shingle. He's a medical doctor. I think he was the sixth or seventh black doctor in Indianapolis's history. There were probably 3 or 4 who were practicing medicine alongside of him when he became a medical doctor in 1897. And he is a medical doctor, but he wants to be a surgeon. But there's no hospital in the state of Indiana that will allow him to work as a surgeon. So once he gets his surgeon's training under his belt, he creates the first ward sanitarium, which was a few miles, well, not a few miles, about a mile down the road from where his facility is that you're familiar with. And for a couple of years, he has that facility. He also makes house calls, and he continues with his education and training. And he decides to go to the Paul Hemus Clinic in Brooklyn, New York. And he spends about 6 months there. And he undergoes training on advanced surgery procedures and the use of x-rays. And he did that in 1903, 1904. And he comes back in late 1904. And in November of that year, he marries your great-grandmother. And it was a big celebration that your great-grandmother, Zella Locklear, who was a school teacher, and Joseph Ward, who was a medical doctor, had this great marriage. And they talk about the people going up and down Indiana Avenue where his place was located to different businesses and homes in the celebration that evening. So that starts his career in a different path in 1904, right after he came back from the Paul Hemus Clinic. And there is a write-up about his facility being really nice. It was well appointed, the newspaper said, in that the white doctor who was there who had helped train him said that he would not be opposed to having his own medical needs met in that facility. He thought it was so nice. So he goes on to practice medicine. He treats many people. He and your great-grandmother opened their home to Madam Walker when she comes from St. Louis to Indianapolis, as she's starting her business. And for some time, she stayed there with them, and your great-grandmother took her around the state to different communities on Sundays after church to demonstrate how to use the new hair care products that she was bringing to the market. And that would have been about 1911. And then World War I comes along in 1917. The United States enters in 1917. This war starts in 1914. But the United States didn't enter until April 1917. In the Washington Bee, the Washington Bee newspaper actually quoted your great-grandfather in saying that there was something going on in the world and that he wanted to be a part of it. He was talking about the First World War. And he signs up to be a medical doctor and is sent to Fort Des Moines, Iowa for training. And the first and only time in U.S. Army history, they held the Medical Army Training Camp hyphen colored for colored doctors. And there were 106 of them who went through that program and graduated. And of that 106, your great grandfather at 45 years old was the oldest of the bunch. He was also one of the most skilled surgeons. And by the time the training is over and they are now headed toward the East Coast and to the ships to be sent overseas, the camp staff wrote in the record for him that he was a skilled surgeon, or not a skilled surgeon, he seemed to be a skilled physician, in that he demonstrated all the talents that he needed to be a skilled Army surgeon, and that they recommended that he be promoted at the earliest opportunity. And the reason that's important is that all of them leave Camp Des Moines as first lieutenants. Typically, when a medical doctor goes into the Army, they're a captain, which is one step above first lieutenant. But the black doctors are all made first lieutenants. By the time he leaves Fort Dix, New Jersey, he has been promoted to captain. And he's assigned to the 92nd Division of the U.S. Army. And during World War I, there were two all-black divisions, and the black combat soldiers served in those two divisions. The 92nd Division, Buffalo Soldiers, or the 93rd Division I think they may have been called the Black Rattlers, but don't quote me on that one. And the 93rd and the 92nd go to France. The 93rd serves in northern France. The 92nd, that your great-grandfather was in, is in the southern part of France, along the German border. And one of the reasons he wants to join the Army, and most of the other black doctors as well, is that they realize that these black soldiers being drafted, your grandfather's a volunteer, or your great-grandfather, he's a volunteer. But these black soldiers are going to need medical attention. And it's known and understood that white doctors and nurses are not known to be friendly or to be kind to black patients. And there's no reason to believe that during the First World War, the military would be any different. At the same time, there's an opportunity to serve your country and to serve as a doctor. So they take the challenge and they go. And one of the people that I found out about was a black soldier, an officer, Lieutenant Aaron Fisher, who was severely wounded in a night attack and probably would have lost his leg had it not. And he's assigned to the 92nd Division. And let's understand that when I talk about that, the way medical treatment worked in World War I is that if you were injured, they got you off the line to an aid station. And that aid station, or they call it a dressing station, they would bandage you up and then send you back to a field hospital, was where your great-grandfather was in an Army field hospital. They sent Fisher back to this Army field hospital, and chances are they would have taken his leg off, but your great-grandfather and the other doctors who were there with him, those black doctors decided that they would not take his leg off. They saved his leg. He spent several months in the hospital. In fact, he finished the rest of the war in a hospital. But your great-grandfather that's an example of what they did, of what the kind of service that they performed is to deal with these men who had all kinds of injuries, gas injuries where they were hit with mustard gas, and some of them their lungs were severely damaged, their eyes were damaged, some of them were blinded. They treated all kinds of horrific injuries, things that we had never thought about before the First World War. The machine gun wasn't invented just before the First World War. There are horrendous injuries being caused, and he is there in the middle of that. And personal thing about him is that you mentioned Buddy, their son, Joseph Jr., who died during the pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1918. I haven't found a record to document this, but I did find out that a black doctor, a light-complected black doctor who was mistaken for white, was taken to a Army General Hospital, which sits behind the lines, behind the field hospital. And I believe what happened was that he was exhausted, had been working almost 24 hours a day, and news came that Buddy had died. And he collapsed and was taken back to a general hospital because of his condition. And after a day or so, they noticed that someone was adjusting and fixing dressings at night and was doing things for the other soldiers in the ward. And one night, someone saw him. He had gotten out of bed and was going from bed to bed, checking on all the soldiers. who were white, and he was treating them. And then they started to talk to him. They realized he was a medical doctor, and they realized that he was a very talented medical doctor. And these white doctors, who I think were from Virginia, recommended when he was leaving that he be promoted up to not just being a doctor at field hospital, but being the commander of field hospital. And they, I don't know if it was intentional or if it was accidental, neglected to mention that he was black, because he told them he was. But by the time he told them and they actually had a chance to meet him and talk to him, they accepted him as a true professional. The U.S. Army, without actually verifying everything, promoted him to major and sent him back to the field hospital he came from, where that commander, who was a white doctor, had been promoted to another position. And it was only after he got back and people realized what had happened that people really got excited and, this can't happen and on, but it was too late. The orders had been cut. Word had leaked out into the public and into the newspapers that this had happened. Of course, by this time, here on this side of the ocean, people like W.E. Du Bois, NAACP had gotten word of it. So they couldn't back out. They had to leave him in that position. So he becomes the first African-American to lead a U.S. Army field hospital. And he's the first African-American to be promoted to major in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. There was a second one that was promoted just before the end of the war, and he was from Evansville, Indiana. So these two black men from Indiana become the first two black doctors to lead Army facilities in World War I in France. The war is over. He comes home. And Aaliyah Bundles, in her book, talks about him being at Camp Upton, New York. He was held up to treat other soldiers who were too sick or too wounded to go home. So they had to do something with him. They held him at a place called Camp Upton, New York, which was on Long Island. And it was a segregated black hospital. And there was your great-grandfather and some others taking care of them. And somehow he gets word that Madam Walker has taken ill in St. Louis. And they put her on a train and they sent her from St. Louis to New York. And then he gets word and gets permission, gets leave of absence to leave his Army facility and accompany the train from New York City to Irvington, which is north of New York City. And at Irvington, they take her off the train, take her to her home, and she's there for a couple days, and she passes away with him at her bedside. And eventually he gets back to Indianapolis in about June. The war ends in November, and Madam Walker dies, I think, in May. And it's not until June until he finally gets back to Indianapolis. And then I had to think about that and realize that when Buddy died, your great-grandmother and your grandmother were the two who had to. Your grandmother was a child. She was younger than Buddy. That's who took care of Buddy and had him his funeral and everything else in that major crisis here in the city, where there were people who were dying from the flu daily, and she had to do that alone because her husband was halfway around the world dealing with men who were dying from the flu or dying from combat injuries, and she had to stand alone to do that. And then he gets home and they have Buddy move to a different place in the cemetery, which is a much more sightly place that you and I visited. And he picks his life back up and starts trying to become a medical doctor again. And he does that in Indianapolis. And then the United States government gets the great idea to create a all-black segregated hospital for the black veterans of World War I. Already the United States had somewhere around 180,000 black veterans from the Civil War, and some of them were still alive in 1920, but there were not a lot of them. But now we have nearly 400,000 black veterans that are entitled to treatment at U.S. veterans hospitals, and many of them were turning these black veterans away. So the solution was to create Veterans Hospital number 91 in Tuskegee, Alabama. And when the Army agreed to do that, when the Veterans Administration agreed to do that, they created Veterans Hospital 91. It was going to be a segregated black hospital, but it was going to be run by white doctors and white nurses. And the story was that there was no one African American capable of running that hospital or staffing that hospital. And that's when the Black community got up in arms again and really took the government to task. And while he was overseas and just after he came back, Dr. Ward made the acquaintance of General Hines, who had been in charge of logistics for the U.S. Army while I was in Europe. And Hines was impressed with your great grandfather's ability to, as a leader and as an administrator. He just seemed to be able to do all the things that needed to be done. So, on Hines' recommendation and others, your great grandfather is selected in 1923 to lead the Tuskegee Veterans Hospital. They'd already chosen a white doctor who was beginning to select all white staff. And again, just like your great grandfather and others had believed that these veterans would not be treated fairly and properly if they were allowed to be treated by just any of the random white doctors and medical professionals assigned there. So your great grandfather is selected. He spends the first 6 months of his appointment touring other veterans facilities to see how they're operated. And then in June of 1924, he takes command of Veterans Hospital 91. And he immediately sets out to hire an African-American staff. He hires an African-American head nurse. He hires every one of the doctors. In fact, every one of the doctors, nurses, medical professionals were all African-American. And he hires an African-American from Howard University who has an MBA to be his logistics and supply person there at Tuskegee. And this guy was the one who made sure that all of his paperwork and everything was in order, down to the T, that they could track and could account for every penny that they received and they spent. This blackhead nurse hired other Black nurses from around the United States to come to Tuskegee to be nurses at Tuskegee. Dr. Ward reached out to medical training facilities across the country looking for young African-American doctors and interns who would be soon graduating and needing somewhere to come to Tuskegee. So basically, he was getting the best and brightest in all these different fields. The Tuskegee VA Hospital, which is also known as Veterans Hospital 91, it became Tuskegee, I think, in 1933. But in 1924, when he went there, was Veterans Hospital 91. It sits a mile down the road from Tuskegee University. And this was intentional. Tuskegee University's president, Robert Moulton, had facilitated the creation and the placement of Tuskegee VA right next to their campus and had provided a couple hundred acres of land for the government to build on. But in doing that, they also gave their allied medical program a place to train for their medical professionals, people coming out of school being nurses and other allied healthcare professionals. They could actually get jobs as students there at Tuskegee VA to get practical hands-on experience before they graduated and went out into the world. As we were kind of alluding to a minute ago about how Black people were treated in the Army hospital, where the fear was, the same thing we knew was going on in civilian hospitals. So there was a real need for Black medical professionals because Black people didn't trust, and reasonably so, did not trust the medical profession. The medical profession had preyed on African Americans since almost when the first ones got off the boat in 1619. Black people had been the focus of medical experiments.
One of the things I want to talk about and just, come back to, and I hope that, our listeners are really sitting down and processing everything that Leon Bates is saying. This was a critical time in American history. When we think about, World War I, what that took, Spanish influenza, how he was the grandson of a doctor who also enslaved his mother and his grandmother, right?
Yes.
And the audacity it took to get up and leave Wilson, North Carolina, go to Indianapolis And, this doctor, George Hastings, was able to,
George Henson, yes.
help him and motivate him. So along the way, I mean, his story is truly an American story. It's definitely an African American story.
Yes.
And I want, one of the things that I wanted to just kind of pivot to is the food portion, and food is medicine. I remember, I was invited to Tuskegee
Mm-hmm.
last year. Just quick story about how this all came about. My mother died, and she had held the torch for decades, as far as long as I can remember. My grandmother held the torch. She had journals written of their entire story. Then my mother took on the torch, and then I took on the torch. Then Leon took on the torch. Then Alelia Bundle. So it's this small collective of us who have been advocating and pushing to get his story out to the world. And when I was invited to Tuskegee, prior to that, I was just thinking, like, let me see what's out there about, my great grandfather. And then I saw a link of messages that the Veterans Affairs Department was going to give an Exceptional Service Award 100 years later to Dr. Joseph Henry Ward. Also talking about some of the things that had happened to him while he was at Tuskegee University, 91 Veterans Hospital, and kind of giving him his, support and the award that he sorely deserved even back then, 100 years later. So I was invited to Tuskegee University, and they named a food pantry. The Veterans Hospital named a food pantry after him. And it got me thinking just about how food is medicine, is a huge part of his story, of that time period, of Black doctors during that time period. And I remember my grandmother telling me stories about the barter system and how they would wake up in the morning and there would be batches of, food or fruits and vegetables on the front porch. And that was their way, African American laborers and farmers of the time, to pay for services when they didn't have money. So there was a huge barter system that was happening in our communities.
Yes.
And then at Tuskegee, or I should say the Veterans Hospital at number 91, he was also responsible for working with Black farmers to make sure that the diet and nutrition of these World War I veterans who needed care had the best access to not only healthcare, but also to food. What eventually would somewhat be his downfall, and and the reason why they pushed him out of the hospital.
Yes. And let's start with food as you're describing it. One of the things that he did, one of the Black nurses he hired, I think her name was Geneva Patterson, became the head dietitian. And Geneva Patterson went out to all of the Black doctors there in that county and made arrangements to purchase their entire crop of whatever vegetable or fruit they were going to grow. It didn't matter. She would buy it and buy it all from them, and she would pay them market rate. And the local co-op, which was run by a group of white farmers, had been selling their produce and products to people for decades down there. And everything was going through them. Even the Blacks had to sell to them at a discounted rate and got a discounted profit from it. Rather than go to the co-op, she went straight to those Black farmers. And the Black farmers at first didn't know what to make out of it, but eventually they all started to sell to them. So the veterans hospitals were allowed to purchase food locally. They got many of their products, like the Department of Agriculture, when they got bulk flour, bulk sugar, and we're talking 50, 100-pound bags of these things. But for the locally grown things like green beans, corn, fruits like grapes and apples and peaches and pears, those things they were purchasing locally. And Geneva Patterson had a checkbook, and she could write a check for whatever the local rate was for these products. And she bought it straight from these black farmers, which sorely irritated the white power establishment in the county where Tuskegee Hospital is located. And they tried more than once to get your great grandfather to come to the co-op and buy from them, and he refused. And when they went to the local congressman down there about it, and your great grandfather told the congressman that under the Veterans Administration rules, he was allowed to buy from whoever he chose to buy from. And he was buying specifically from those black farmers, everything he could get his hands on. The other thing was that Veterans Hospital, and people need to understand that this was the largest black hospital in the United States. In 1924, they had more than 600 beds, which made it larger than most hospitals in the United States. The only larger ones were, for example, Bellevue in New York, um, Cook County Hospital in Chicago, in whatever the hospital is in Los Angeles and San Francisco. Those were the larger hospitals than Tuskegee. Your great grandfather's running the fifth or sixth largest hospital in the nation. And inside that hospital complex, he had a bakery that baked all the breads, the dinner rolls, cookies, pies, cakes. All that stuff was made on site. And there were black bakers who were making it. They canned vegetables right there on site, so they would have them to reuse during the winter months. So with all of those fresh vegetables they bought, they cooked some and others they canned so they'd have later. The same with the fruits. They're canning peaches and pears and all those kind of things. And all that is being done right there on site. So you had to have a full kitchen staff that knew how to bake, who knew how to cook, who knew how to butcher. They were oftentimes butchering sheep, goats, lambs, cows to have meat products there on the menu at that hospital. So in some ways, people don't understand when they built Tuskegee Hospital and put it down there in Tuskegee, Alabama, in many ways, it was a great job creator. It was a economic engine for all of the money that was going to be spent there to house and treat those veterans. And people need to understand that if you were an African American veteran of the First World War after 1924, when they built that hospital, and you needed medical treatment, I don't care if you lived in the state of Washington, state of California, state of Florida, or the state of Maine. Those are the four corners in the continental United States. You had to go to Tuskegee, Alabama for treatment. You had to get on a train and you had to travel to Tuskegee. So when you got there, Joseph Ward and his staff wanted to make sure that whatever treatment you needed, including food, as you said, food is medicine, that you got good meals, 3 good square meals a day. Think about the number of chickens and eggs they had to have. If you're going to serve people 2 eggs a day, or 2 eggs at each breakfast, that's more than 1,200 eggs a day.
I want to talk a little bit about just HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities.
Mm-hmm.
When I saw PBS Origins, I was so happy. I cried when they told the story of what happened at Tuskegee and how, the KKK had come and basically tried to burn it down with the advent of just even building this hospital and hiring someone who was going to be African American as a lead hospital. And I was so happy to see his face on there because for decades, his story has been buried. And I mean, all the information is out there about him, his relationship with his deep friendship with W.B. Du Bois. I mean, I heard all of these stories as a child, so Black history for me, was,
Mhm.
was right in our family, it was right in our legacy. And if
Yes.
these stories were carried down in, journals and stories, and you were able to even get an historical marker from the state of Indiana on the actual site where his hospital, the Ward Sanitarium, once existed. And we visited that. I want to just talk about just, painting a picture for our audience just about that time period, for HBCUs, and also you know, I won't say those are what we call race men who are pushing towards um, a society where African Americans could have thrive and be in safe spaces. And I know that he was an educator. I know he trained so many nurses and doctors at that time, and so many of them went on to do amazing things, and some of them went on to do controversial things. But I would love for you to just talk about the importance of HBCUs and just those men and women of that time.
Let's talk about Tuskegee University itself, sitting there just to the side of the Tuskegee VA. One of the things that your great grandfather did was to create and run medical conferences every summer while the university technically was shut down, so the dorms were not being used. They ran these clinics, if you will, and they invited Black doctors from all over the country to come to Tuskegee, and they could stay in the university's dorms. And they're just a mile down the road from where the hospital was. And they could come to the hospital and they could see surgeries being demonstrated. They could see all the latest ideas and treatments, for different ailments. TB was a very big problem. Tuberculosis was a very big problem in the 1920s. We didn't get a really good treatment and cure for tuberculosis until the 1950s. But in the 1920s, there were men, especially Black men who had been in the First World War and been held in those confined spaces for a long time, coming down with tuberculosis. And a great number of the men being treated at Tuskegee VA were TB patients. So anyway, he creates these summer clinics. And what I found fascinating, we talked a minute ago about the Tuskegee syphilis study, which starts in 1932. But in 1924, 1925, those summers, when they had those clinics going, one of the things that the doctors at Tuskegee, these are young doctors who have just graduated from some of the best medical schools across the country, they were used to study and they were used to writing scientific papers. They were presenting their research papers on how to treat tuberculosis, the best treatments. There's no cure, there's a treatment, but they were also demonstrating treatments for syphilis. There's still no cures, but they are successful treatments. The U.S. government's U.S. Health Department initiated the Tuskegee syphilis study. And on the Tuskegee campus, that's not been torn down yet, the building still exists, the old John Andrew Hospital, where those Tuskegee syphilis experiments took place, just a mile down the road from Tuskegee VA. There's no way in the world that Dr. Eugene Dibble, who was running the John Andrew Hospital and was coming over to Tuskegee to observe and to learn, that he did not know that they had treatments and that these Black doctors had published papers on treatment of syphilis. And they were in the journal, the National Medical Association Journal. In the United States, we have two large medical associations: the American Medical Association, which is predominantly white, now anyone can join, and the National Medical Association, which is predominantly still African American. The National Medical Association was created because the American Medical Association refused admission to Black doctors. So a counterpart was created. And that one of the things the American Medical Association does today is publish research findings done by medical professionals all over the country. But if you were Black in the 1920s, 1930s, you couldn't get that done. So the National Medical Association provided a platform for publishing your research findings. And if you go, I think it's to the National Health and Sciences website, you can actually find those same journals. They have been digitized and they're up on the website. And you can find where they were talking about treating syphilis in 1924, 1925, before the Tuskegee syphilis study started. They're already talking about how to treat it. best practices. And none of those practices included what went on at Tuskegee after 1944, when penicillin is put on the market. The US government from 1944 to 1972 continued to withhold penicillin from these men. So if they were at the John Andrew Hospital, they didn't get the penicillin treatment, which was a cure. But if they were a mile down the road at the VA hospital, they got penicillin. And one of the Black doctors who was training with your great grandfather knew this information. And that was the kind of thing that really made me sit back in my chair and shake my head and go, I cannot believe this. But then again, this is why we needed people like your great grandfather and others, because African Americans were never going to get the same treatment that some of the white patients got, most of the white patients got. And even growing up, my mother went to nursing school. And growing up in a house with a trained nurse, she had no idea some of these things. She didn't go to nursing school to the 1950s. She didn't know. So there's no way in the world you and I would have known unless somebody like myself and a few others started to actually go back in some of these old journals and this old documentation and start pulling this stuff out. And just a couple of years ago, I did a presentation at IUPUI here in Indianapolis, Indiana University, Indianapolis campus, and talking mainly to the medical students and medical staff. And one of the nursing books I had a chance to look at, and it's published after 2015, I'm sure, it still insists that African American skin is thicker than white people's skin. That African Americans have a higher tolerance for pain than whites. This is in a modern medical textbook. This is why we needed Joseph Ward and his contemporaries, because without them to actually push back and to show, to demonstrate that these things were wrong and that we knew they were wrong and that there were proper ways to treat a patient, no matter what their race, no matter what their sex, no matter what their creed, no matter how you want to define them, there are proper ways to do it. And in some ways, to just shame the larger community into doing the right thing.
Now, he would, his career ended abruptly at the Veterans Hospital, 91, and finally,
Yes.
100 years later, he received an award, a recognition for the wrongdoing that occurred. He returned to his private practice. And by that time, a lot of these hospitals were now integrated in Indianapolis. And, I remember my mom telling me how they turned the hospital. Now, I need you all to understand, those that were listening, this was a home. Ward Sanitarium was our family home. They lived on different floors and he operated on a different side of the home. But because, due to these hospitals now opening up to African American patients, of course, he kept some of his, private clientele, because he even, delivered babies. He delivered my mother. He delivered all her best friends. He was known for being the doctor of Indianapolis.
Yes.
But he turned the sanitarium into a boarding house, and they had all kinds of characters living at the boarding house, and that included at one time, obviously Madam C.J. Walker. This was a time period in African American communities where they had to rally together to support each other, and so their boarding house was not only a place where you could get seen by Dr. Ward, but you could play bid whist with Zella.
Yes. Yes. There was a large and very jovial social environment sometimes. Your great grandmother was a socialite, and quite often they would do things like that. In the house, people need to understand it was a very, very large frame house, 2-story, like you say, with multiple rooms on both the first and second level. And that is, at first, I'm not sure what it was built to be, but they bought it and turned it into ward sanitarium. And I think the family lived on the first floor on one end, and then most of the, if not all of the second floor, was the hospital treatment area. And then part of the first floor may have also been used as an office space and maybe an exam room. But yes, that was a large house on the near north side of Indianapolis. And as you mentioned a minute ago, we got a historical marker put up for Joseph Ward in the sanitarium. The sanitarium was torn down in 1965 to make way for Interstate 65. The northbound on-ramp at 21st Street runs almost through where the building would have stood. And it had been torn down and gone for decades when we went through that process of getting the historical marker there. And when I first submitted the application to the state of Indiana, no one knew what I was talking about. Like, what's he talking about? Where did he get this idea? And one of the things I did when I wrote up the application, I submitted a research paper with it with lots of footnotes so people could go back and find the documents in the books that I had used to create this narrative. And when they checked, everything checked out. It was true. And even the local medical association here did not know. There was one retired Black doctor who knew what I was talking about, and he had written a history of Black doctors in Indianapolis. So he knew who I was talking about and what I was talking about. Now, I don't know how well, if he even knew your great grandfather, but he did know the story. But that was the only person I talked to that knew what I was talking about and understood the significance of it. And once people started to hear me talk about it, they were aghast that this was going on and that it had gone on for so long here in Indianapolis and across the country. It wasn't just an Indianapolis thing. This was how it was all across the United States. And think about that. Tuskegee VA Hospital was from 1924 until 1948 was the only hospital, the only veterans hospital a Black veteran could go to. By 1948, we're talking about World War II veterans. And it wasn't until 1948 when President Harry Truman integrated let me back up. He didn't integrate, he desegregated the U.S. military. The Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, all got desegregated. Well, the same was true for the Veterans Administration. It got desegregated. But until then, all of them had to go to Tuskegee, Alabama for medical treatment. Just think about that. I don't care where you live, it's where you had to go. And while they were going down there, at least while your great grandfather was there, they could and there are records we had found where they had interviewed patients and the patients said they were well treated, they were well fed, they liked what was going on. No one complained. In the 12 years that he was there, they passed every annual inspection and review with the highest markings. They scored higher than many white hospitals.
It's a lot to process. And, I want to just kind of end this conversation. And we're going to have many more conversations. And I highly suggest that my listeners look online to some of the, lectures that soon to be Dr. Leon Bates has delivered to so many medical associations. And I attended one in particular where he talked about Black doctors in Indiana, which I was just blown away. I would love for you to talk about just the importance of Indianapolis to American history, and with a particular focus on African American doctors during the time period that you spent a lot of research on, the Gilded Age, the Reconstruction era, et cetera, and the Progressive era.
Oh, wow. Something I hadn't thought about there. It is kind of amazing to think about how medicine changed from the time your great grandfather got his medical license in 1897 until the First World War, when the United States enters in 1917. There were radical shifts, and probably one of the biggest ones was what's known as the Flexner Report, which was published in 1910. And the Flexner report basically talks about medical education in the United States and Canada and how bad it was, how slipshod medical education was. And you could basically go through medical school and never actually participate in a surgery. You could go through medical school and never have touched a microscope. And in 1910, when the Flexner report was published, many things changed. Now, because they knew the Flexner report was coming and Flexner and his staff had been working on it for several years, in 1908, Indiana created the Indiana University School of Medicine. And it took in its first class in the fall of 1908. In that year, the subscription medical schools that existed, and there were like a half a dozen of them in the state of Indiana, they all closed. That was the end of those. Because there were many things that came out of the Flexner report, like your great grandfather went from high school to medical school. There was no requirement for a college degree. And it's something that your mom and other people, and I've even seen some mention of it in records, that kind of bothered your great grandfather, that he found himself being a medical doctor without a undergraduate college degree. But he is a known and accepted skillful surgeon nonetheless. And think about, like I said, when they went back in his hospital in 1922, in his ward sanitarium, they noted he had a laboratory where he could actually type blood, where he could look at blood under a microscope and see what was going on because he was doing that kind of thing already. Think about that. I have seen records where white-owned hospitals did not have laboratory facilities, did not have x-ray facilities. They could not legally have a maternity ward because they didn't have the state mandated equipment and materials to have a maternity area. And he has all these things. He is light years ahead of many of his contemporaries, white or black. We found that there had been 4 black hospitals in Indianapolis's history. The most successful and long-lived was Ward Sanitarium. And I know I'm gonna make you cry with this one too, but let me say this. I don't think there's any way in the world that your great grandfather would have made it as far as he did and done all the things he did without your great grandmother. There's an old saying that behind every great man, there's an even greater woman. And Zella Locklear was that woman. They were married for 50 years. And you think about that. They're married for 50 years, and she lives with him through the First World War, the pandemic, and losing a child. Then they pack up from 1924 to 1936, and they go to Tuskegee, Alabama. And if you've never been to Tuskegee, downtown Tuskegee is so small, they don't even have a town square. They got a town L. They got half a square. That's how small it is. And that's why your grandmother, as a child, they sent her to a boarding school in Atlanta that was affiliated with Spelman University. That's why she was there, because there was no school, no proper education for a black child in Tuskegee. But because of that job, they could afford to put her in that school, which I understand she really did not like.
Listen, my grandmother was a character. She loved her parents. She loved
Yes.
her parents. She didn't want to be separated from them by any means. She even met my grandfather at Tuskegee, and he graduated from MIT as an engineer in the 1930s, and he was a professor at Tuskegee, and they married on Tuskegee's campus. So she was ready to go back home because she didn't care for Atlanta. She just wanted to be around her parents.
No, your mom had me, cracking up about that. She did not like it, but I think she understood what her parents were trying to do, is that it was a unique opportunity that your great grandfather had to run that hospital and to demonstrate to the world that an African American man and an African American staff could run a 600-bed hospital. By the time he left there, they were up to almost 1,200 beds. And that he could do that. But in order to do that, Zella had to uproot the family from Indianapolis to Alabama, put your mom in a boarding school in Atlanta, and then quite regularly drove herself from Tuskegee, Alabama to Atlanta, Georgia, and back to visit. Even when he couldn't go, she could, or she did.
I remember my mother telling me this story. He received an award from Tuskegee years later.
Yes,
And I love to
yes.
go through the archives. And my mother, I'm sure she probably told you the story as well, but I'll tell my listeners. I think she needed an outfit. And
It was a hat.
it was a hat.
It was a hat.
It was
She
a
had an outfit, but she didn't have a hat. And they had driven down to Tuskegee, and your mom had gone with them. And your mom was a young girl, about 12 years old or so. And your great grandmother was like, wait a minute, a young lady needs to have a hat. You need to have gloves, a purse. She had everything but the hat. I think she forgot the hat. So they stopped at a store to purchase a hat. And this is at a time when African Americans were not allowed to try on clothes and things like this and go in and just walk through a store and pick up things. Your great grandmother marches your mother into the store and leaves your great grandfather out in the parking lot in the car. And they try on hats to find the proper hat and purchase this hat. And there were several white people who were in the store. Your mom said her mouth just hanging open as she put a hat on her and then took a step back, put her hands on her hip, cocked her head, looked at that, and no, that's not right. And picked up another one. And after 2 or 3, 4 trials, she found the one that she liked and went to the front, paid for it, and they went out and got in the car and continued on their way.
This is the 1940s.
This is the 1940s, maybe the early 1950s when this happened.
And this is Alabama.
Yes. And your grandmother, your great grandmother goes in with your mother.
Yes.
And purchases this hat in a white-owned store.
They were going to the awards, and
they were going to the awards.
Yes. Have a hat.
She was going to be properly dressed. Yes.
Yes.
A young lady wore a hat and gloves and carried a purse.
I want to end this beautiful conversation on just, why is it important? I mean, to talk about Black history, to talk about people like Dr. Joseph Henry Ward, and particularly, markers, historical markers. You fought so hard to make sure that this historical marker was on the land where Ward's sanitarium existed. And it was such a huge turnout. I mean, there were veterans from all over who came and said, I never heard. I mean, they were Black, white, Latino, for wherever. They came to the inaugural moment where we opened up the community to learn more about Dr. Ward and enjoy in the work that you did in your research to have a historical marker on this land. Why is it important?
What made me dive into trying to get a historical marker installed was I went back to school many years after working in the electrical field. And I decided I wanted to do something other than work in, say, engineering. So I go back to become a historian, or at least go back into history. I was still an undergrad student, didn't know what grad school was at the time. So while I'm there was a plan to build a statue called E Pluribus Unum in Indianapolis. It was designed by Fred Wilson, an African-American artist from the East Coast. And it was not popular. Wilson had been inspired by a statue that's in Indianapolis on what's called Monument Circle. If you ever come to Indianapolis, ask somebody to show you where the circle is. Everybody knows where the circle is, but it's actually called Monument Circle. And on the west side of Monument Circle, there is a statue of a African-American who has a broken manacle, a broken chain on one of his wrists, and he is reaching up to Lady Victory, if you will. He's in a seated position reaching up to this white woman. That is the only statue in Indianapolis to an African American. And there are many statues And it's been said that Indianapolis is second only to Washington, D.C. for its statues and monuments and memorials. But the only one we have to an African American is on Monument Circle. And he is a bare chested African American with a broken manacle on his wrist as he is reaching up. His hand is above his head. So you can see this. Wilson decides to create E Pluribus Unum, which is inspired by that. And it's a bare chested African American. And he is holding on to a staff. And at the end of this staff, there's a banner. And the banner is made up of all the flags of Africa. And when I got my chance to point out what I thought the problem was with the whole E Pluribus Unum idea, I said, first off, Indiana's in the history books as a free state. It was not a slave state, although there was slavery in Indiana, but it was small scale. Second of all, there were many African Americans from Indiana, from Indianapolis, who had done great and meritorious things that are not recognized. And third, I told him, I said, you look at that staff you have on there. I said, that's wrong. And then he wanted to argue with me and said, no, those are the flags of Africa. I said, yes, they are. But I want you to think about something. The first African nation did not exist until 1959. Slavery ends in the United States in 1865. There is no way that an African descended person is rising up out of slavery in the United States in 1865 with the banner on the end of a staff that represents all of Africa. I said, that is historically incorrect. And then I was cut off in the conversation by a man who used to be an African-American man who was deputy mayor of Indianapolis many years ago. And he was trying to steer this conversation we were having at the Walker Theater of all places in the Walker building downtown. And he said something to the effect that other than Madam C.J. Walker, there was not a single African-American worthy of a monument or statue in the state of Indiana. And this man's African-American. And I sat there and could not believe what he was saying. And by this time, the room erupted. And there were both black and white people in this room. And many of them got very vocal behind his comment. And I made up my mind right then that, yes, there were people, we needed to know who they were. And just because he didn't know, didn't mean other people didn't know or didn't need to know. So I was doing a grad class at Wayne State University, and part of the exercise in that class was to write a grant proposal. So I got the bright idea to get an application for a historical marker here in Indiana, and I filled it out and wrote the narrative as a grad school class. Got an A for it. And then when the class was over, I submitted the application thinking it was going to get turned down. And to my surprise, it was accepted. And then I had to figure out, well, how do you pay for it? What do? You had to have a dedication ceremony. And that's how I met your mom, was that I thought, oh no. Now I got to find out who his family is, where they are, what they think of, and what are they going to think of me rooting around in their family closet? Who are you? Why are you doing this? So I tracked your mom down to a book publisher that had published a book she had done several years ago. And I asked them to forward my contact information to her and asked her to call me, and told them what I was doing. And then I nervously waited for the phone call. Your mom called in a couple days, and I was on pins and needles and, didn't know what to expect. And she was overjoyed. She said, I cannot believe you're doing this. How did you get onto this story? And on and on and on. And then by the time she finally took a breath and slowed down, she said, your name's familiar. What's your father's name? And my father and I share the same name. And she goes, I went to school with your father. To show you how small this world is, your mom and my dad went to the same grade school. And we're in the same class at one point. This is why we need to tell these stories, is that who knew what your great-grandfather had contributed to the history of the United States and to the African-American population. And we need to know this. We need to know who these people were. And through all the adversity, through the Jim Crow period of the United States history, there were people out there working hard to change their life and everyone to come behind them's lives. And one of those people working at that, or I should say two of the people, let me back up. Joseph Ward and his wife Zella, because I don't think Joseph could have made it without her. He could not have made it that far.
I want to thank you personally. I'm probably going to cry for an hour after we cut. Every time I talk to you, and it just my mother was so grateful, for the work that you have done. Just I'm so passionate and so I admire researchers in this world because they uncover so much about our stories. And, we have, it was always painful for my mother, and my grandmother that his story was never celebrated or honored because he did so much. And I'm also grateful to the Veterans Affair that, finally gave him this incredible award 100 years later, even though they didn't even know that he had any, family that still, existed. But I know that the ancestors led me to respond to a former employee of the Veterans Affairs Department to say, no, Dr. Ward does have family. I'm right here. I'm his great granddaughter. So, and I'm looking forward to Lilia Bundo's book that is coming out soon about her Madam C.J. Walker's daughter. Super looking forward to that. And I'm excited to hear what's next for you. What's next for you?
I'm currently working on a project for another historical marker here in Indiana. It's going to be in a little place called Lyles Station, Indiana. It's a small Black farming community in southwest Indiana, just north of Evansville, if you look at the map. And in 1927, the local county hospital and the local school board got together and decided to try a new experimental treatment for ringworm, sometimes referred to as tetter. And ringworm at the time then and today is still easily treated with either iodine or lye soap. And one or two shampoos with that will cure ringworm. Well, they got the bright idea in 1927 to try using X-ray to kill ringworm. This had never been tried in that part of the state. These folks got an X-ray machine at this hospital. They did not really know how to use it. There were no statistics or anything on what level the machine should be set at for how long to expose them to the X-ray. None of this existed. It had never been tried. They took 10 children from this Black school in Lyle Station into the town of Princeton in Gibson County. And one by one, they X-rayed them, 10 children between age 5 and 12. And they over X-rayed them. The radiation permanently burnt the hair off their heads and damaged their scalp. And one of them, the youngest one, it damaged his skull. Now, even though he did live to be 80 some years old, by the time he died, he had very nasty scars on his head from this. And I am going to, in the next few weeks, hopefully, submit an application for a historical marker for that incident, which I'm sure it's not going to be very well received by some people when they read the narrative I wrote about it. But that's my next project.
Well, I thank you for your work, and I think about historical markers. We have a lot of historical markers here in New Orleans that tell, buried histories. And,
Yep.
and I think about one of the most controversial historical markers, the Emmett Till's marker that is constantly shot up. We realize how important historical markers are. It's not, something that's just, something that we just walk past and ignore. No, these historical markers are pivotal to everything that is happened in the past, as well as what is happening today.
Yes.
I want to thank you so much, soon to be Dr. Leon Bates.
I'm working on it.
For honoring, my great-grandfather for lifting up my namesake, Zella Locklear Ward. And I hope that through this interview that listeners can, learn more about him, learn more about Black doctors during that time, even looking at the show that you suggested that I watch, The Nick, which blew my mind.
It is something else.
It's something else. We have come a long way, but we have so much more to go.
In talking about The Nick, where you go, is if people go and look it up, and you can see it on Amazon Prime, just type in The Nick, K-N-I-C-K, and it will come up. The Black doctor's character in that movie, the things he experiences, kind of very much mirror what your great-grandfather went through. There's a scene in there where he's actually sneaking people into the basement of the hospital to give them medical care because the hospital upstairs, the white hospital, will not admit them through the front door. So they're sneaking in the back door at night to be treated by this single Black doctor who is there, who actually takes a couple of women who work in the laundry and turn them into nurses. One of them, because she's such a good seamstress, that she is actually suturing up the people that he's doing surgery on. So yeah, if you want to kind of understand what your great-grandfather went through, what life looked like, check out The Nick. It's very historically accurate.
It put a lot of things into perspective for me. And I just want to thank you once again from the bottom of my heart, from the descendants of Dr. Joseph Henry Ward. Thank you. And Zella Locklear Ward. Thank you so much. And I know my mother is, sending you love from wherever she is. So
yes.
Thank you all for listening to another episode of Culture and Flavor. We appreciate the support.
I wake up in the morning and I'm feeling a vibe. Give thanks to the Father, I'm breathing alive.
Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.